Was there hoarding before capitalism? Most of us have seen TV shows about hoarders, like the show called Hoarders, or Hoarding Buried Alive, or Hoarder SOS, Hoarder Homes, No Room to Move, The Hoarder Next Door, and Confessions, Animal Hoarding. These are just a few. There are a lot more shows and YouTube channels and all kinds of media focused on hoarding. So I've been watching some of this and I started wondering, is hoarding just a modern thing? Did it exist before capitalism? If it did exist, what would it even look like? So technically my question is, was there hoarding before capitalism? But if we focus too much on the capitalism piece in this video, we're going to get all sidetracked. If we start talking about exactly what capitalism is and when capitalism started in world history, y'all, that could be a video all on its own. So I'm not really going to focus on that. Instead, my basic question is just this. Is hoarding a modern phenomenon that is only allowed to flourish because we have so much access to consumer goods? Or is it something that's always existed? Were people hoarding 5,000 years ago? First, let's just start by defining hoarding. According to a 2014 paper all about hoarding from the New England Journal of Medicine, hoarding is characterized by persistent difficulty in parting with possessions, which results in severely cluttered living spaces, distress, and impairment that are not attributable to other neurological or mental disorders. This paper begins with a psychiatrist describing an otherwise healthy 53-year-old woman whose apartment is so full of stuff she can't even stay in it anymore. She's been living in the basement of her apartment building, eating in restaurants because she can't use her kitchen, and using a local gym for showers. But the thought of getting rid of anything makes her feel anxious and upset. So this is prototypical hoarding behavior. The most commonly hoarded items are newspapers, old clothing, bags, books, and paperwork. Hoarding can include either valuable items or completely worthless items. And one of the key characteristics of hoarding is that people who do hoard report lots of emotional distress at the thought of getting rid of their items. If you live a cluttered life, but you would be happy for someone to come in and clean up your mess and throw 90% of it in the garbage, you're probably not a hoarder. Hoarders report having very strong sentimental attachment to their items, feeling like all these items are going to be useful someday, or that they're so beautiful they can't be thrown away. They report a lot of attachment. Hoarding runs in families and does seem to have a genetic and an environmental component. So, for example, scientists think they have even pinpointed the exact gene that is responsible for hoarding. But everyone who has that gene won't necessarily be hoarders. There's also an environmental component as well. Usually hoarding will start after someone has gone through a particularly stressful or traumatic event. So hoarding has already been proven to be biological and environmental. But could hoarding also be cultural? Could hoarding be something that only happens in our modern culture and not something that has happened throughout history? Let's look at the evidence. Ancient people, and we're looking here mostly at prehistory, definitely cached items. They created caches of resources or weapons that they could go back to. A lot like some birds or squirrels will create caches of items for the winter. So we do know that people, for example, in the Upper Paleolithic time, did cache or hoard resources. However, there's no evidence that this is the same kind of thing or idea, or that people were feeling the same sorts of things as modern hoarders. There is no evidence for hoarding as we know it today. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that ancient people didn't hoard. Maybe they did. There just isn't evidence of it. If there were hoarders 10,000 years ago, they probably would have been collecting things like leaves or twigs that then would decompose, so we wouldn't really see evidence of it. So just because there isn't any evidence doesn't mean necessarily that they didn't do it, but it seems likely that they probably didn't. Now, I mentioned leaves and twigs specifically because psychiatrists in the late 1800s reported patients who hoarded leaves and twigs in their rooms of their asylum hospitals. So we know that that definitely is a behavior that sometimes people engage in. We just really don't know if ancient people did that or not. Now let's zoom on up to look at written history. During this period of time, people definitely hoarded valuables. We know this because we can find their hoards today. Archaeologists find hoards of goods, which usually include things like food, armor, or weapons, coins, valuables, all collected in a hoard, and they're either buried or sunk in a bag in a swamp. But again, what we're seeing is these hoards are pretty different than what we were thinking of when we think of modern hoarders. These people were collecting valuable items and hiding them away in times of insecurity. In the past, people hoarded because of war, political uncertainty, social upheaval, crime, and just simply lack of banks. Where are you going to put all your valuables if you don't have a bank? Well, it makes sense you might bury them in your yard. For example, Northern Europeans buried caches of coins out of fear of Viking raids. 5,000 years ago, there were hoards of religious objects in Mesopotamia. 3,000 years ago, there were hoards of mummies in Egypt. There have been hoards discovered in both China and Britain of valuable bronze vessels and coins. However, just like with ancient people, there is no evidence at all of obsessive collecting the same way that we see in our modern world. For example, archaeologists have found and categorized tens of thousands of household inventories now from medieval Europe. While most of these inventories do contain a few useless items, none of the inventories contain thousands of useless items like you would expect from a modern day hoarder. Obsessive collecting definitely did exist in written history, but we're talking about collections usually that only the richest people could afford to have, and they were categorized and organized. This wasn't the same thing as modern day hoarding. Throughout written history, there are ancient tales of dragons, for example, that would hoard lots of items, but there's no evidence that people applied this concept to other people. So we know the concept existed, but if it's applied to dragons and not people, it's hard to say for sure if hoarders as we know them existed. Even if someone wanted to hoard thousands of years ago, let's say they had the gene that's associated with hoarding today, it would have been very difficult for them to do so because at the time, most items were recycled. You couldn't just hide them away in your house. Clothing was stitched apart once people were done with it, and then the fabric scraps were then stitched back together to make something new, for example. Metal objects that were too old to be used anymore were melted back down again and made into another metal object. So even if someone did have the hoarding gene, they probably couldn't really hoard items that were old or no longer useful because those items would have been recycled. Now, we do have written accounts of people being accused of being hoarders, but if you read those accounts, they aren't really describing the same kind of hoarding that we would today. They aren't describing people who are collecting objects, they describe people who are collecting money. So it's kind of the same idea as penny pinchers, misers, people who don't share enough with their neighbors. Those sorts of people were condemned and they were often called hoarders, but there aren't really descriptions of these people who were called hoarders living in houses that were piled up with junk. From the late 1700s to the early 1800s, that's where we start getting this concept of hoarding. Now, still, there isn't a lot of evidence that hoarding was widespread, but we're just starting to see the very beginnings of the concept. Originally, hoarding wasn't about collecting a bunch of stuff, it was about collecting books, and it was called bibliomania. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, books were expensive, but they were within the reach of wealthy people, specifically wealthy men. So it became kind of a trend for rich men to collect lots of books. Men collected books that they never read. The writers who speak out against bibliomania usually highlight this as their problem. If you collect a lot of books but you read them, then these authors of the late 1700s and 1800s usually gave you a pass. After all, you're using the books for the purpose that they're intended. But there was quite a bit of moralizing against the men who collected books just as objects and would never read them. Interestingly, we know that people did collect other items besides books, but when they did so, usually it was seen as a variation on bibliomania. Bibliomania, the collecting of books, was seen as the thing that people did, and then if you collected something else, then people would say, oh, you're a bibliomaniac, except you collect shells or you collect snuff boxes or whatever. For example, in 1809, Thomas Dibdin created a mock treatise about bibliomania in which he says there are other manias besides that of the book. He lists people who collect horses, hawks, dogs, guns, snuff boxes, old china, coins, and even rusty armor. Now, during this period of time, the British generally saw bibliomania as very cool. It was a cool, eccentric character trait that some people had. It definitely was not seen as a mental illness. It was sometimes seen as a problem if someone bankrupted themselves over books, but generally it was seen as very cool. In the mid-1800s, hoarding became a lot less cool. In France, the French elites started to see bibliomania as a serious problem. For example, in 1840, one French intellectual described a bibliophile who descended into bibliomania and collected 600,000 books in his Paris home. They were piled in stacks, almost like walls, around the chaotic home, and the books threatened to collapse on anyone who walked past them. The author does say that the collection of books could be mistaken for any other mania since they weren't functioning as books. They weren't being read. So we're starting to see this concept of bibliomania really branching out and being applied to other collectors of stuff. In 1842, a doctor first described this kind of obsession and describes an illness which is a passion for books, stamps, military pins, porcelain tableware, coins, snuff boxes, and shells. The doctor specifically describes someone who's mentally ill and collecting books. This patient became famous in Paris after his death because of his huge, awe-inspiring collection and obsessions. By 1897, a paper titled Collecting and Compulsive Collecting describes a patient who collected scraps of food, hair, bones, straw, and rags simply because she was afraid that her neighbors might use these objects in witchcraft against her. But apparently she had thousands of these types of trash items sitting in her house. So we're starting to see the shift away from only the richest people can collect a ton of books, and isn't that cool because they're so rich, over to genuine concern about people who are collecting too many items. It was around 1900 to 1950 when the real shift toward seeing hoarding as a mental illness happened. In 1893, William James, the famous psychiatrist, described a miser who collected newspapers until he could barely squeeze through the narrow channels in his house. James's popularity ensured that by him describing hoarding in this way as a mental illness, that the public was also going to start seeing hoarding as a mental illness rather than a cute, eccentric character trait. So it was between 1900 and 1950 that public perception of hoarders started slowly shifting from this is an entertaining story about an eccentric to genuine concern or even stigma against a mental illness of hoarding. Now, this was all part and parcel with the new movement called scientific housekeeping, in which women, because they were always the ones taking care of the houses, were encouraged to be very clean with their housekeeping and get rid of germs. This was all part of the new understanding of germ theory and trying to encourage people to lead clean lives. Now, keep in mind that this was all wrapped up with religion during the time. This was all a movement that said cleanliness is next to godliness, and it encouraged domesticity, monogamy, Christian marriage, nuclear families, etc. While Victorian houses had a lot of clutter, what we would today call clutter, everywhere, lots of decoration and lots of excess, it was during this period of time from the 1900s to about 1950 that clutter started to be seen as a place for germs, dirt, and cobwebs. And women were encouraged to not over-furnish their homes. All of this was directly tied in with race and class because the public perception in the Western world, at least, was that too much stuff was something that a non-white family would do. It might be something that an immigrant family would do or a lower class family would do. So having less was very tied in with racist and classist ideas. In 1947, probably the biggest incident associated with hoarding in public imagination took place. This was when the Collier brothers passed away in their house in Harlem, New York. The two brothers, Langley and Homer, were from very wealthy, very prominent families in New York. As they were older, they lived together in their house in Harlem. Langley was the hoarder. Homer really wasn't by most accounts, but Homer had a disability that meant that he had to rely on Langley's care. And Homer really couldn't leave the house or start cleaning it up in any meaningful way. So as Langley became more and more of a hoarder, Homer was just kind of stuck in this house. Eventually, the house became so full of stuff that there were small walkways and narrow locations that you would have to kind of like shimmy your way through in order to get through the house. Langley kept collecting more and more and more stuff, and especially was afraid of people in the neighborhood in Harlem coming into his house and stealing what he had. That's what he said. He set up booby traps in the hoard so that if burglars tried to get in, they would be stuck in the hoard. Eventually, Langley ended up being crushed in the hoard himself and passing away. And because Homer had a disability and couldn't leave the house to get any help, he died of starvation inside the house. Someone realized that they hadn't left in a long time and called the cops. The cops tried to get into the house, and it took them days to recover both bodies. And then it became a public spectacle. People came from miles around to stand outside the Collier house and watch as it was emptied. Now, I want to emphasize here, the Collier brothers didn't just become famous because they were hoarders. There was a racial element to all of this. They were rich white men who had refused to leave Harlem even after it became a black neighborhood. Because they were from a rich and powerful family in New York, newspapers all across the country covered the Collier brothers' deaths and the subsequent removal of all the stuff from their houses. At first, the public waited, expecting that because the Colliers had been so wealthy before, surely their house was full of treasures, antiques, gold, something really valuable must be hidden there. So the newspapers would cover the story day after day. What's been taken out of the Collier brothers' house now? But as the story went on and it became very clear that the Collier brothers' house was just filled with junk and garbage and that there wasn't any treasure to be found, newspapers started covering the story differently. Harlem was already portrayed as a socially disorganized place, a wasteland, a place where morals go to die, a place with only the most degenerate people, a place where social rules are broken. Before their deaths, the Colliers gave a super racist interview in which Langley denounced all of his black neighbors and bragged about his money and white heritage. Langley claimed that he had to dress in tattered rags because the blacks would murder him for his money otherwise. He also said that he had to make his home look like no one lived in it so that those scary blacks, in his mind, wouldn't attack him and his brother and take all the stuff that they had. So as the Colliers' home was slowly being emptied out and it became more and more clear over days and weeks that their house was just full of garbage, newspapers started covering it like the degeneracy of Harlem had somehow influenced the Collier brothers and made them live a degenerate life of hoarders as well. After the Collier brothers' death, several years later, books were published about them, and many of these books, in the aftermath of their passing, directly linked the dereliction of their house with the supposed dereliction of Harlem and the supposed dereliction of blackness. Many of the researchers that I read said that the Collier incident can't be overstated in understanding how Americans today view hoarding. Americans today view hoarding as chaos, mental illness, degeneracy. Something has gone wrong, terribly, terribly wrong for hoarders. And it's viewed that way in large part because of the part that the Colliers played in public imagination. The racist public saw the Colliers as rich white men who should have been at the top of society, but instead were dragged down into hoarding by the blacks of Harlem. So during this period of time, hoarding, as the media would see it, was intimately tied up with racism and classism. From the 1950s to today, we see the rise of collecting. Lots of people in history have collected one thing or another, but it was only in the 1950s that collecting became accessible to the normal person and that it became cool to collect things that really aren't very valuable. After World War II, it became trendy to collect items like coins, glassware, hymnals, Revolutionary War propaganda, baseball cards, nutcrackers, elongated pennies, or all things Elvis. This can be called the democratization of collecting, and it was enabled by post-war consumption. Magazines that were devoted to collecting really took off during this period of time. Covell's Antiques and Collectibles Price Guide told people exactly how much their collectibles were worth. The Covells warned to be a collector and not a hoarder, but the reality is the line between collecting and hoarding is not that clear. Collector culture celebrates the normal collector and shuns the hoarder, but in reality, psychiatrists have a really hard time delineating between those two categories. Most psychiatrists and psychologists will say that there is definitely a difference between collecting and hoarding, but when you ask them to actually define the difference, all these definitions become very fuzzy. Some psychiatrists will claim that collectors are organized while hoarders are not. But then they might label a patient as just having a collection even when that collection isn't organized, and they might label another patient as a hoarder even when that collection is organized. Some mental health professionals claim that the difference between collecting and hoarding is how much you love an object. They'll say that collectors really love all the objects in their collections, but hoarders are just collecting for the sake of having any object at all. But again, that doesn't really hold up. There are lots of hoarders who don't just collect anything at all, and there are lots of collectors who seem to collect almost everything. Sometimes mental health professionals will try to make a distinction based on how the object makes you feel, but both collectors and hoarders say that objects make them feel good. Sometimes mental health professionals will try to say that collectors and hoarders are different because collectors will collect valuable things, whereas hoarders collect trash. But again, that distinction doesn't really hold up either. How many people have you known who have collections that you thought, man, I would never collect that. I think it's all junk and I would throw it all away. A lot of us feel that way if we're not in that collector's world. So the reality is that even though most mental health professionals will tell you that there is a big distinction between collecting and hoarding, the reality is it's almost impossible to actually articulate what that distinction is. So as collecting has become more accessible to the average person in the post-war consumerist economy, so has hoarding. Hoarding has definitely increased because of the easy availability of lots of cheap goods, but there may be some other reasons as well. Maybe instead of having emotional relationships with people, hoarders are having emotional relationships with their stuff. And this could be rising because of how isolated and individualistic our worlds are. A lot of us don't know our neighbors. We might not have very many friends. We might be isolated from family because we live really far away from them. And because of that isolation, we're pouring our emotional energy into stuff. Not only that, modern global capitalism endlessly markets to us to buy more stuff, to be addicted to shopping, and to see our objects as extensions of ourselves, as reflecting our personalities. So hoarding has developed and increased because of modern global capitalism.